1. e4 immediately stakes a claim in the center, controlling key squares and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for rapid development and potential tactical play. This move, the Sicilian defense, immediately challenges white's central pawn and creates an unbalanced pawn structure, leading to sharp, complex positions where counterplay on the queenside is a key theme for black. Developing the knight to f3 prepares for central pawn expansion and controls key squares, signaling white's intention to enter mainstream Sicilian defense theory with a flexible setup. This move initiates the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the center and prepare for development while preventing white from establishing an ideal pawn center. This move directly challenges black's pawn center, aiming to open lines for piece activity and create imbalances, a core idea in the open Sicilian. This move correctly initiates the open Sicilian, a dynamic and strategically rich variation where black aims for active piece play and counterplay against white's central pawn majority. White recaptures the pawn, developing the queen and maintaining a strong central presence, which is typical of the open Sicilian lines where white aims for rapid development and central control. This move initiates a well-known variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to pressure black's queenside and potentially disrupt their development by creating a pin on the knight. Black develops the bishop to contest white's active bishop on b5 and prepare for castling, a common response in many Sicilian variations. This move exchanges a bishop for a knight, resolving the tension and simplifying the position while creating doubled pawns for black, which can be a long-term structural weakness. This recapture develops the bishop to a more active square, preparing to contest the open c-file and utilize the d5 diagonal. This move develops a knight towards the center, reinforces the pawn on d4, and prepares for kingside castling while avoiding the immediate pressure on the queen. Developing the knight to f6 supports the central pawn and prepares for castling, while also challenging white's queen. This move, bg5, targets the knight on f6, creating a pin against the black queen and intending to disrupt black's pawn structure or gain material if black is not careful with their defense. This move prepares to challenge white's active bishop on g5 and aims to solidify black's kingside pawn structure, opening lines for queenside development. Castling queenside prepares to launch a pawn storm on the kingside while also connecting the rooks and keeping the king safe from central attacks. This move correctly develops the bishop and prepares to castle kingside, reinforcing black's king safety and tidying up the position according to common Sicilian Najdorf theory. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's knight and aims to disrupt their coordination, potentially opening lines for white's attack. This capture opens the d-file for your rook and maintains a solid pawn center, preparing for further development and potential attacks against white's king. This capture on e5 reopens the central diagonal for white's queen and continues the pressure on the kingside, aiming to exploit black's slightly underdeveloped pieces and exposed king. This move actively develops the queen, preparing to potentially castle queenside and contest the open c-file, while also offering support for a d5 pawn push in the future. The move 12. nd4 repositions the knight to a more central square, increasing its influence over key squares like e6 and c6, while also preparing for potential attacks on white's queenside. Black finally castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future central play. Having completed essential development, this move initiates a kingside pawn storm, aiming to dislodge black's king and create attacking chances by opening lines. This move is a prophylactic response to prevent white's knight from advancing to g5, which would attack the queen and put pressure on black's kingside. This prophylactic move, kb1, repositions the king to a safer square, avoiding potential threats on the c-file and preparing for future pawn breaks or piece activity on the queenside. This move places the rook on an open file, a standard strategic principle, aiming to pressure black's d-pawn and create counterplay along the d-file. This move prepares to defend the pawn on e5 and potentially supports a future g4 pawn push, aiming to restrict black's kingside mobility. This pawn sacrifice by black opens the h-file for white's rook, creating immediate tactical possibilities and disrupting white's king's safety. But it simultaneously opens the g-file for black's rook, creating counterplay along that newly opened diagonal. Opening the h-file with this pawn capture creates new attacking possibilities against black's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move forces the white queen to retreat, preventing immediate threats on the d6 bishop and preparing to develop the kingside pieces further. This retreat of the queen from the kingside pressure, specifically from the g5 square where it was potentially vulnerable, allows the white king to escape the open h-file while repositioning the queen for potential counterplay on the queenside or to support a central advance. This move strategically repositions the knight to a safer square, preparing to recapture on d6 if white captures the pawn and also potentially rerouting the knight to a more active central or kingside outpost. This move repositions the queen to attack the vulnerable kingside pawns and potentially create mating threats along the h-file. This move abandons the king's safety on f8 after white's ambitious pawn push and rook activity along the h-file, potentially exposing the king to further attacks. This move, nf5, aims to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and create attacking chances by potentially exploiting the weakened g-file and targeting the king. This pawn sacrifice, exf5, decisively opens the e-file for white's queen and rook while removing black's central defender, creating significant attacking chances against the now exposed black king. The rook now occupies the open e-file, preparing to apply pressure against black's weakened kingside defenses and potentially support a pawn breakthrough. This move aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for the rook's advance while also defending the f5 pawn. This sacrifice of the rook on e6 exploits the exposed black king and the pinned knight on e8, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create attacking chances against the king. This exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating doubled f-pawns for black, which will likely become a long-term weakness, while white gains a more active rook on the now open e-file. This move activates the rook on the open file, aiming to control the center and potentially pressure black's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move attempts to centralize the king and activate it for the endgame, but it allows white's rook to infiltrate on the open e-file and potentially create dangerous threats. This move strategically expands on the queenside, creating space and potential pawn advances to disrupt black's king safety and develop an initiative. This move, nc7, is a strategic repositioning designed to protect the d5 pawn and potentially develop an attack along the c-file, aiming to exploit white's somewhat exposed king. This move initiates a dangerous kingside attack, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and weak pawn structure, forcing concessions and potentially leading to a swift checkmate. The move rg8 is a necessary repositioning of the rook to defend the g-pawn. which is under immediate threat from the white queen, and also prepares to contest the g-file should it open further. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the c-file, gaining queenside space and potentially opening lines for future piece activity. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, preparing to contest the kingside and potentially harass white's king if it remains exposed. The capture on f5 wins a pawn and also forces black's pawn structure to become more vulnerable on the kingside, creating long-term strategic advantages. Black recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position and accepting a slight structural disadvantage in exchange for material equality and opening lines for the rooks. This move forces the black king out of its relatively safe position and initiates a direct confrontation, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and coordinate the remaining pieces effectively. The king is forced to move to f7 to escape the check and maintain piece coordination, but remains vulnerable on the open e-file and under pressure from white's active queen. This pawn move aims to regain the lost pawn, creating a passed pawn on the c-file, but it weakens the king's shelter and allows white's queen to become very active. This recapture on c6 strategically exploits black's compromised kingside pawn structure, leading to a dangerous passed pawn on the queenside for white. This rook check forces white to block with the rook on b1, creating an open file that black can exploit with their remaining pieces. This defensive maneuver repositions the king to safety from the immediate checks and opens a path for the rook to potentially join the defense. The recapture of the bishop on e1 has resolved the immediate material imbalance, but white's connected passed pawns on the queenside now represent a significant positional advantage that black must diligently contain. This knight retreat repositions the piece to potentially control central squares and support pawn breaks, while also safeguarding against further complications on the queenside after black's well-timed check. The recapture of the pawn on e5 by the knight on e8 was a defensive necessity, and now the bishop on e5 aims to control key squares and potentially support the rook on a8. This move contests the center and aims to disrupt black's newly formed pawn structure, potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces. This move aims to exploit the weakened dark squares on white's kingside by forcing the king to move, disrupting its defensive setup and potentially opening lines for further attack. The king is forced to move to a more centralized and safer square, away from the immediate danger of the checks and potential mating threats. This move centralizes the knight, aiming to control key squares and potentially support a kingside advance or reinforce the queenside pawn majority. This move continues the king's precarious journey towards safety, seeking to escape the dangerous central files and join the queenside pawns, but it exposes the king to further checks along the c-file. The knight retreats to e7 to defend the pawn on c6 and prepare to redeploy to a more active square, like c6 or potentially f5. This pawn sacrifice with g6 plus forces the black king to move, opening lines for white's pieces and aiming to exploit the exposed position of the black monarch. This move attempts to reposition the king to a more active square, though it leaves the king vulnerable to further checks from white's queen and rook, and doesn't address the immediate threats on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exploit the vulnerable black king and coordinate with the knight to create threats. This move correctly recaptures the pawn, activating the knight and challenging white's queen, but it leaves the king exposed and the pawn structure on the kingside weakened, potentially leading to further tactical skirmishes. This move aims to secure the central pawn structure and prepare to advance the queenside pawns, potentially creating a passed pawn on the c-file after white consolidates their material advantage. This move prepares to challenge white's connected passed pawns on the c and b files, aiming to disrupt white's strong pawn majority. This queen check forces the black king onto a more exposed square, allowing white to consolidate their material advantage and prepare for a decisive pawn push. The king is now forced onto a more active square in this open position, but black must be wary of white's continued threats along the open files and diagonals. This pawn advance on f5 aims to disrupt black's defensive structure, potentially creating a passed pawn on the f-file or opening lines for white's rook and queen into black's king position. The knight repositions to f8 to support potential knight maneuvers on the kingside, while also freeing the e7 square for the king to escape further checks. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure and open lines for white's remaining pieces. The move 40kg8 seeks to improve the king's safety by moving it to a more secure square, anticipating white's continued pawn push on the kingside and potential threats along the g-file. This pawn push aims to create a decisive passed pawn on the g-file, potentially overwhelming black's weakened kingside defense. This move aims to centralize the rook and create attacking chances on the queenside by supporting the pawn advance and potentially freeing the square for the knight. This move shifts the queen to attack the c6 pawn and prepares to pressure black's queenside pawns, aiming to exploit the weakened structure after the exchange of pieces. The knight on a1 is out of play and cannot support the attack on the kingside, suggesting white's queenside expansion with the b-pawn has created significant space and activity. This move initiates a decisive pawn storm, aiming to open lines and exploit the black king's compromised position, leveraging the powerful control over the 7th rank and the threat of further pawn advances to create winning opportunities. The move attempts to defend the b2 pawn and centralize the rook to a more active square, anticipating white's pawn push to f5. With white's pawn on g7, the immediate threat of promotion on the g-file forces black to defend actively, creating tactical opportunities for white to exploit weaknesses in black's position. The capture is forced, but black's king is now exposed and will likely face significant pressure from white's remaining pieces, particularly the queen and potentially the rook on the g-file. White's queen move forces the black king into a more exposed position, setting up a potential discovered attack or further checks as white's pawns advance. The rook's retreat to g8 is a necessary defensive maneuver to protect the king from the immediate check and prepare for potential counterplay along the g-file. White plays nf4, bringing the knight to a more active central square where it supports the advance of the f-pawn and pressures black's d5 pawn, while also preparing for potential kingside play. This move is a desperate attempt to create immediate threats, but it allows white's knight to capture a key pawn and gain significant central control. The king steps out of danger, centralizing to support the pawn push and prepare for potential exchanges or further king activity, while also avoiding the immediate check. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the queenside pawn push and potentially create counterplay against white's exposed king. The knight repositions to h5, aiming to attack the vulnerable g7 pawn and potentially set up a decisive discovered attack or a mating net if black's king remains exposed. This move initiates a desperate counterattack, seeking to exploit the vulnerable position of the white king and potentially create a perpetual check. The king must move to safety after the king's side has been completely dismantled by the queen's attack, opening a clear path for the rook check. The move 50. K2 is a desperate attempt by white to escape perpetual check. But black's king is too actively placed and the connected passed pawns on the queenside are now unstoppable. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to support the potential advance of the d-pawn and create counterplay against white's weakened kingside.